If everyone would please take a seat. I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting number 5 of the Early Childhood Education Task Force. I was hoping co-chair would be here. I'm sure she'll be here in just a moment. I would remind everyone before the meeting starts to please either turn your cell phones off or silence them. And I guess she's going to come in. Mariah, if you would please call the roll.
Senator Schroeder. Senator Thomas. Senator Wilson. Representative Bowling. Representative Raymond. Representative Sharp. Co-Chair Heverin. Co-Chair Carroll.
Here. Okay, we do have a quorum. I would entertain a motion to accept the minutes from the last meeting. Motion, Senator Wilson, second. Senator Schroeder. Okay. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Minutes are approved. Let me set the stage for what we're going to do today. We have some representatives from the NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, that will be presenting through the majority of the meeting. And rather than try to call in folks from several different states to hear about how they're structured in early childhood education and to talk about those states that have children's cabinets, a separate cabinet for children, we decided to get in touch with NCSL and ask them, those of you who are here present know about the NCSL, know that they are one of the most respected bipartisan organizations in the country that provides expertise in many different areas. So they are kind of a clearinghouse when we need information on issues that we're looking at, that they can provide a level of expertise and research and data that it would take us a long, long time to pull together. So we have asked them to present today to talk about various models and to talk about, I think there are 8 states maybe that have children's cabinets. And this kind of intrigued me a little bit in conversations with Dr. Vanover. And I know that, as a state, we're looking at the cabinet. We're looking at the possibility at some point maybe breaking up the cabinet and doing some restructuring. Don't know if that'll happen, but I thought it was a good time. And with all the issues that we have surrounding children, and is it something we need to look at as a Commonwealth? Is it something that would benefit early childhood education? All the health issues with children, safety issues, everything. Would it be to the state's benefit to create a cabinet for children just to focus on those issues? I don't have an opinion one way or the other, but I think it would be, I think we at least ought to vet this out, the idea, and take a look at it and see, and maybe something we could look at in the future. But with that being said, we have with us Ms. Allison May, who is a policy specialist for children and families programs with NCSL, Jill Yorty, who is a senior policy specialist, children and families program, and we also have Ms. Jenna Bannon with NCSL, and all 3 of these ladies are here via Zoom. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I would ask that each one of you please introduce yourselves for the record. And Allison, are we going to start with you, or who's going to go first?
Yes, and Jenna's not here. She sends her regrets, but you're in good hands with Jill and I.
Okay.
So I am Allison May, ALISON-MAY, with the National Conference of State Legislatures. And thank you, Chair Carroll, for the invitation. Let me share my screen. How does that look?
And we're seeing the presenter view, Allison.
How does that look?
Perfect.
You would think after all these months, we'd have it all down, but that is not the case.
Yeah, you're good. Go ahead.
All right. So good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. As I said, my name is Allison May, and I'm an early care and education policy specialist at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm here today with my colleague, Jill Yordy, who is a senior policy specialist focused on child welfare and the prevention of child maltreatment policies. And today, throughout our time together, we're going to go back and forth sharing information with you. With that, Jill, you want to let them know what we have in store?
Sure thing. Good afternoon. And for the record, my name is Jill Yordy, Jillyordy. And early childhood governance is a rather complex topic. So throughout today's presentation, we'll share information both about the big picture of governance concerns, as well as many more specific examples of how states have approached governance around early childhood and child policy more generally. We'll start off with a brief overview of NCSL, then talk about how states use several common terms in slightly different ways to help ground the rest of the conversation. We'll discuss the three main types of approaches to early childhood governance that we see across states, and then we'll take a closer look at some specific state examples that use these different strategies. We'll also share some legislative trends from 2021 and 2022. These will be specific examples of legislation specifically related to the question of early childhood governance. Finally, we'll wrap up with some high-level policy considerations and ideas for next steps as you consider what makes the most sense for Kentucky's early childhood governance. And Allison, would you share more information about NCSL and the supports that we can offer to legislatures?
Yes. So Senator Carroll, you did an excellent job, but for those in the room that may not know, the National Conference of State Legislatures is the country's most trusted bipartisan organization, and we've been in existence for over 40 years. So our goal is to promote policy innovation and provide opportunities for lawmakers to share knowledge, and really to ensure that there's a cohesive, strong voice at the federal level on behalf of states' rights. And we do all of this because we know that the legislative institution is an important one, and that when states are strong, our whole country is strong. So we, as I said, we're a bipartisan membership organization. We serve all 7,383 legislators and the more than 25,000 legislative staff from the states, commonwealths, and territories. And interesting fact, after redistricting, we will be serving the 7,386 state legislators, since we're adding 3 additional seats. The core of our mission really is to provide information to our members so that you all can do the best job possible for your constituents and your states. So we don't advocate for any particular specific policies, but instead we provide research, technical assistance, and opportunities for policymakers and staff to exchange ideas and learn from others in the field. So on this slide, you see the core programs that we have within our organization. And Jill and I actually are situated in our policy research division, and we're housed then within our children, youth, and families program. You can think of that akin to what most states would call human resources or really human services. And we focus on 5 broad topics: child support and family law, child welfare, early childhood, economic mobility, and housing and homelessness. I'm going to pass it over to Jill, who's going to help ground us by defining some commonly used terms throughout the country.
Thanks, Allison. We want to start our discussion of governance with some brief remarks about common terms, because NCSL's Children and Families program tracks legislation dealing with governance of child and family policy in several of our databases. And we see that states use these common terms in some slightly different ways. Later in the presentation, when we share state examples, this discussion of terms should help make it easier to compare and contrast approaches across different states. So the top 3 terms on this slide, cabinet, department, and agency, are all generally used to refer to the highest tier of organizational structure within a state's administration. The term cabinet, some states use this term to refer to a collection of agencies and services, such as Kentucky's Cabinet for Health and Family Services. Other states use the term cabinet to refer collectively to the appointed or elected heads of departments who meet regularly and advise a state's governor, such as in the case of our home state here in Colorado. Some states don't use the term cabinet at all, such as Georgia, which brings us to the term department. In the case of Georgia, their executive branch is organized with commissioners who oversee departments, which are then the highest level of organization for administrative programs and services. Other states use the term department as more of a second-tier organizational structure, so you see it used in a couple different ways. Agency is often used as a catch-all term for this highest level of administrative organization when we're talking about governance. And so we'll, in our presentation, when we're talking in more general terms, we'll often use the term agency to refer to this highest level. Then the second two terms, office and division, generally refer to lower level organizational structures within a state's executive branch. And before I pass the baton back to Allison, I do also want to mention a little bit about the state of research around governance approaches. In research on public administration and policy, one of the central debates over the last century has been whether centralized or decentralized models are better for promoting good outcomes. And the research findings have been mixed, so it is very much an ongoing debate. And it's very difficult to design research around this because so many factors influence the quality of outcomes. And to highlight just two recent studies, in 2016, a study that looked at the effects of centralization or decentralization on early childcare and education programs across state agencies, looking at the outcomes specifically of children's reading skills in kindergarten. And they found that children seemed to benefit the most in that reading skill outcome when programs and services were administered under a more decentralized model, as long as it wasn't too decentralized. So they found that those benefits started to disappear when these programs were spread across too many different departments or agencies. In contrast, a 2018 study on child welfare permanency outcomes found the reverse, that permanency outcomes were better when a more centralized structure of government was used across states. And so while those two studies are not linked on the slide, if you're interested in them, I'm happy to provide those studies. So please reach out to us after the presentation and we're happy to provide those. Slide. And with that, Allison, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you. So as we continue to turn our attention to the topic at hand, I think it's really important to consider why states embark and discuss, even in some instances, scrutinize the governance. And what I mean really is the infrastructure, administration of programs serving young children. And states embark on these sorts of conversations for a handful of reasons. What I'm going to share with you is not an exhaustive list. And so I challenge everyone in the room to jot down on a piece of paper or just think through in your mind while I'm speaking, what are the reasons that Kentucky might embark on this discussion and what are the goals you hope to achieve? So first, addressing the dispersed authority and accountability for key early childhood services in fragmentation is something that we find very important. And so states find that really the authority is scattered across multiple agencies, different offices, bureaus, divisions, often located within different agencies. And this fragmentation, as it's called, really occurs both at the state level, but also could occur at the program level. So when states are confronted with this, they realize that if they align and better integrate, they might see better outcomes in their children and families. So thinking about allowing early childhood systems to to sustain itself over political and administrative changes. So as you all know, early childhood services and systems truly are fragile. And so changes in governance structure could potentially help to bolster and foster better sustainability over time. When we think about efficiency, we're really thinking about improving the allocation of decisions, reducing duplication of different efforts, and helping to realize the return on investment. So in this context, efficiency does not necessarily mean fewer staff or fewer dollars being spent, but instead being smarter and having a more cohesive approach to allocating and not duplicating efforts. So assuring public accountability in areas such as quality, availability, accessibility, and outcomes. So you could ask yourself, can a change in governance structure lead to better accountability for the state over time? Promoting consistent quality across the full continuum of early childhood services. So some states might find that quality across the early childhood services varies based on the age as well as the location of the program. So states often use governance to focus on more consistent quality across the diversity of early childhood settings. And then finally, elevating and drawing attention to the importance of early childhood programs by having an appointed or hired leader. So someone who is looking at all the work and really being the voice to draw attention to the importance of the programs that affect the early years. I'm going to toss it back to Jill so we can hear about increased interest in looking beyond just early childhood programs and really thinking about the wider universe of early childhood services and starting to think more upstream strategies.
Thanks. One of the things that we are seeing at NCSL across states in the child welfare policy space in particular is an increased attention over recent years on the prevention of child maltreatment, so the prevention of child abuse and neglect. And as states are turning their attention more to these upstream prevention strategies, one of the things that's happening is that's bringing the policy around child welfare and child maltreatment prevention into closer contact with policies in other areas such as early childhood or housing, because many of the existing strategies that states have found to be effective in those areas are prevention strategies. And we're seeing more and more research really showing that there is a link to lower instances of child maltreatment when these prevention strategies from other policy areas are being used. Allison, if you could advance the slide. So in the world of early childhood governance, we find three general different approaches that states use. And it's important to understand as we talk through the next three slides that no one approach is considered best, and decisions about how to proceed are often very specific to the context of each state and what the state hopes to accomplish at a particular moment in time when they're having these governance conversations. The first approach that we'll talk about is collaborating and coordinating. And this is where early childhood policies, and sometimes children's policies more broadly, are spread across multiple different agencies with mandates from the legislature that these agencies communicate with each other, collaborate with each other to help align processes and rules and funding requirements such that it promotes better outcomes for children. And hopefully, as I mentioned before, with the difficulty in researching governance, over time, we hope that researchers will spend more time looking at some of these different approaches to be able to offer further guidance and considerations about when different strategies may work best for states. And Allison will talk through the next two strategies or approaches.
Thanks, Joe. So the second example we wanted to highlight is called consolidation. And this really means moving multiple program functions, including programs like preschool, childcare, home visiting, to be managed by a single office that also has broader responsibilities. So as this map indicates, there are 13 states and DC that have consolidated services for young children into a single office, sometimes called a division, within an existing state agency. And most typically, we see those offices exist within either education or a human services agency. So realignment of existing programs sometimes is an appealing option because it can lead to better service coordination without running up against state constitutional restrictions on creating new agencies. And then finally, we see the approach called creating, and this would be creating an early childhood specific lead agency responsible for multiple programs and functions. And as the map shows, there are 8 states who have taken this approach, creating a new early childhood agency with a director or a commissioner, excuse me, that reports directly to the governor and is a member of the governor's cabinet. So when you elevate early childhood programs to a state agency level, it could create opportunities to serve children and families more efficiently through really having integrated whole family approach in mind. The resulting enhancements in program delivery and also data collection and data sharing. And those two pieces can really help inform children and families and how to drive future improvements in the state. I do want to mention that Colorado and Oregon on the map in front of you recently, 2021, enacted legislation. So they're still in their implementation period. And then New Jersey introduced legislation to create an early childhood agency just in May. And so working through the legislative process might be a state to consider. We're going to spend some time now over the next 3 slides, actually looking at a total of 5 different states to get a little deeper into these models we just outlined. Jill?
Great. So we'll start with the one we just talked about, this CREATE model. And often what we see when states consider this option is that they really want to elevate early childhood programs to the level of a state agency, or as in Kentucky's case, a cabinet. And this helps to create opportunities to serve children and families more effectively by having that integrated whole family approach where the mission of the agency really helps align all of the services that are offered through that agency. The resulting enhancements in program delivery, data collection, and data sharing can provide some benefits to states and help inform how young children and their families are supported to help drive improvements. To talk about 2 specific examples, we have Georgia, which has a relatively long history of working to improve the efficiency and interconnectedness of children's services. Georgia is a state that has moved through several of these different approaches and models over time, and their Department of Early Care and Learning has been in existence since 2004 when it was signed into law. So this may be a state to consider to look at the long-term development and outcomes that come out of a shift in governance like this. Mm-hmm. And I want to highlight a couple unique aspects of Georgia's transition. In the early 1990s, Georgia recognized the need to provide more specific opportunities and services around early childhood. And they developed a state lottery specifically to generate a funding stream for these specific educational programs, which is very similar to what we're seeing happening now in Colorado. Throughout the 1990s, they continued to kind of develop and modify this approach. And eventually in 2004, legislation came forward, Senate Bill 456, to respond to a recognized need to further streamline the state services to Georgia's children from birth to age 5 and families of those children. One of the interesting things that Georgia is doing is really focusing a lot on data collection and leveraging the data sharing across all of these different programs to be able to engage and partner with researchers to help better understand the outcomes for Georgia's children. In New Mexico, they have taken a very similar approach, although much more recently. So the early Childhood Education and Care Department in New Mexico was established through Senate Bill 22 in 2019, and the department launched the following year in July of 2020. In New Mexico, the department's aim is to create a more cohesive, equitable, and effective early childhood system. And this means coordinating a continuum of programs from prenatal to 5, so a very similar age range of focus to Georgia, in order to ensure that families in all parts of the state can access the services that they need. The department also oversees childcare programs as well as supports such as food and nutrition programs that serve older children and families. In the department's first year of operation, pre-kindergarten enrollment nearly doubled and home visitation services expanded, and a cost estimation study was conducted to better align childcare subsidy payments with the actual cost of care. The department also provides professional development and technical assistance to improve program quality and child and family outcomes throughout the state. With that, I will pass it back to Allison to talk more about the Consolidate approach.
All right, thank you. Excuse me. Now let's look at 2 states who have consolidated or really merged programs into one office within a larger agency. So realignment of existing programs sometimes, as I mentioned before, is appealing if there's the potential to run into constitutional restrictions, which was the case in one of the states I'm going to highlight. So first, let me share a little bit about Florida, where they have the Division of Early Learning. The division ensures access, affordability, and quality of early learning services for the state's children and families. And the division is located within their Department of Education. State policymakers in Florida actually have a very long history with thinking about early childhood programs, where they live and how they interact with one another. Back in 1999, the Florida legislature enacted what they called the School Readiness Act, and they consolidated early childhood education and care programs into an integrated program focused on school readiness services. Excuse me. And the Division of Early Learning in Florida really aims to support children and their families, along with childcare providers, which is something a little unique to say that right out front. The division administers federal and state childcare funds, also partners with 30 local early learning coalitions on how to comprehensively deliver the services statewide. The 3 programs that they are delivering the 3 top programs within the division include school readiness. It offers some financial assistance specific to low-income families, voluntary pre-K, which is really preparing 4-year-old students to enter kindergarten the next year. What's unique here about their universal pre-K is that it could be in private childcare centers, public school entities, or specialized instructional facilities. And so parents really have that option to choose the where, and then also the duration. Is it school year only? Is it summer as well, or specialized instruction for children with disabilities? And then lastly, their child care resource and referral system, which is similar to what you all have in Kentucky, but a statewide network with information for families with young children. So most notably in this recent 2021 piece of legislation, they charged the division to create a more seamless education system. So as Jill was saying, birth through 5, sometimes it's birth through 8. In Florida, the challenge was really think a continual approach, birth through 20. So while it's focused on the early years, but just thinking of the whole continuum of a child. The legislation also created the Council for Early Grade Success. This council plans to meet at least biannually, and they're responsible for reviewing and implementing training and outcomes related to the programs, and to make recommendations, which I think this is key, make recommendations to the Florida Department of Education that support that grade 3 students are reading at or above grade level. which I know many of you know, that there really is a push that reading by third grade is a true indicator of future academic success. And then Missouri, this is the state I mentioned that without changing their constitution, they couldn't create anything, and they realized we can make the Office of Early Childhood, that's now responsible for overseeing efforts to expand and improve high quality early learning opportunities. So in Missouri, what they did was define the problem. And they said that their problem was early care and education programs were delivered by multiple state agencies not communicating well. So before they made this change, early childhood programs existed in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Department of Health and Senior Services, and the Department of Social Services. So that scattered approach, they realized, was causing confusion, duplication of efforts. There were administrative barriers, and also inconsistent access to different programs. So what the solution they decided was to create a unified, coherent early childhood system that can identify and address system-wide challenges and to better serve the children and families. In essence, this early childhood system is easier for families, and that was their goal. The solution was born out of an executive order last year. It was submitted by Governor Ashcroft at the end of January. It allowed for legislators within 60 days to make any arguments or conversations around. The legislature didn't have any issue. They were in full support. And the new office took effect at the end of August 2021. From the beginning, they've just had a very clear, overreaching vision to ensure Missouri's children are both safe and healthy and ready to be successful learners. Within the office, they moved a whole host of things. So childcare, home visiting, early learning and early intervention for children birth through 5, as well as some after-school programs for school-age children. They had a very thoughtful transition period where they had a host over 100 stakeholder engagement events. They had monthly webinars where they talked through what they were doing and when they were doing it. They transitioned 128 state employees into this new office. And they also selected Dr. Pam Thomas as the assistant commissioner of the new office. I talked to Pam. We were hoping she could join you all today. She is more than happy to share information. She's actually making a presentation right now. But if you want to learn more about Missouri, Dr. Thomas would be a great resource. So now that the office has been in existence, they're starting to think about what next? What can we do now that we have our office? And so one of the first things is the Missouri Early Childhood Integrated Data System. So the hope is to start to collect and report on how the kids are doing, and importantly, really let the data drive future decision making. They've also launched a new newsletter that they send out to over 10,000 recipients. And then this year, through legislative action, they created the Missouri Early Childhood State Advisory Council. Again, this was through executive order, but the Advisory Council has monthly webinars with an average of 100 participants. And it's really just that vehicle to cultivate stronger channels of stakeholder engagement, which I think in any approach of governance restructure, having stakeholder engagement is going to be very helpful. So let's go way over to the West Coast, beyond the West Coast, to the Aloha State. Jill and I just want to make sure we do highlight at least one state that works with this collaborate and coordinate model. And as Jill mentioned earlier, there are 29 states across the country that coordinate their early care and education functions. So in Hawaii, they had legislation back in 2017 that converted their early childhood advisory council into an advisory board, and they called it the Early Learning Board. That board oversees the executive office on early learning and is responsible for promoting collaboration across the different agencies and stakeholders that serve young children. So the board advises the governor. The board also makes recommendations to the legislature, and members of the board are appointed by the governor And they include such individuals as center-based program providers, home visiting providers, parents, representatives from the Department of Education and Human Services, Head Start, and so forth. I didn't see any policymakers that had been added, which is, if you were thinking to move in a direction like this, you can always make the decision that policymakers from both chambers need to be part. Now, Jill and I, over the next few slides, we want to back out a little more, look at some of the legislative action we've seen over the last 2 years, and then really dig into what we found to be a unique example when we were preparing for this presentation today. So in 2021, I found these 3 states that all created or attempted to create an agency focused on early childhood. Colorado's was enacted. We have a unified early childhood system called the Department of Early Childhood. The agency, still in development, is going to house 20 different programs and is going to oversee the launch of the state's universal pre-kindergarten program that starts next July. In Minnesota, I'd call attention, their bill in the Senate was a Republican sponsored bill. In the House was a democratically sponsored bill. They were the same, but they were to create the Department of Early Childhood, where a commissioner would be appointed by the governor. They had a decent runway. That's a key piece to keep in mind for them. This was 2021. Nothing was going to happen until 2023. And at that point, the departments of Health, Human Services, and Education would come together and begin the process of moving the certain duties related to early childhood into the newly created agency. Texas also had a similar hope to create a program, create an agency in 2021. The new agency would have been headed by a director who would have been appointed by a committee of designees, a committee composed of designees of the governor, the Senate president, and the Speaker of the House. That was a little unique. I haven't seen that before, but it makes sense that it wouldn't only be the governor, that the legislature would have some say in who that top person would be. Then our other example, and it's sort of a twofer, North Dakota had 2 pieces of legislation related to consolidating their early childhood programs. So House Bill 1416 in 2021 merged the offices of and programs encompassing both child care, pre-kindergarten, home visiting, early intervention, and professional development. All things that support birth through 5 was the age range they determined important. And the goal was really to make things more efficient and effective. They didn't stop there. They had another bill, 1466. It included a new state investment that led to the creation of a grant program for high quality early experiences for children, very much specifically focused on the year before they enter kindergarten. So let me turn the mic to Jill to share some information about what we saw this year in 2022 and go deeper in a state example.
Thank you, Allison. In 2022, we continued to see quite a bit of legislative activity around this question of early childhood governance. These are a selection of bills, but they do kind of show some of the trends that we've been seeing. In New Hampshire, they sought to establish an Office of Early Childhood. This bill did end up not passing. The rationale for creating the Office of Early Childhood was to unify and integrate the early childhood system for children and families. Had this bill passed, the Commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services, in consultation with the Commissioner of the Administrative Services, Commissioner of Department of Education, the Office of the Child Advocate, and the Council for Thriving Children, would be tasked with developing a plan to create the Office of Early Childhood. One of the reasons that that's interesting is the bill itself doesn't specify how it will be implemented, but it tasks specific people within the administration to figure out those logistical details. As part of that, the plan would include recommendations on integrated childcare, early childhood care and education, childhood development, and recommendations for early childhood health, safety, and learning. It would also include a plan for early childhood information systems and some of the data sharing that we've mentioned before. Recommendations on the workforce serving young children. So that's often a consideration, particularly as we are seeing more and more workforce challenges in early childhood. It would include an outreach plan for families and service providers, recommendations for kindergarten and school readiness assessment tools, and recommendations for reporting and accountability of the Office of Early Childhood Programs. In New Jersey, we saw two bills, which are both still pending, one from the Senate, 2475, and one from the Assembly, 4178. These pieces of legislation would establish a Department of Early Childhood in New Jersey. This would help with the current functions of the Division of Early Childhood Education, which is within the Department of Education, to move all of that to the newly created Department of Early Childhood. Other transfers of programs would include the Department of Education preschool through 3 programs, as well as programs serving pregnant women through age 8 of children. It would also cover licensing and registration of child care centers or family child care, respectively. In Rhode Island, Senate Bill 2678, which is also still pending, would establish the Office of Early Childhood Development and Learning. This would be an office focused on a statewide early learning system for children from birth through age 5, and ensure the coordination of federal, state, and local policies concerning early childhood care and pre-kindergarten education to ensure that all children enter school ready to learn. The new branch the new executive branch of state government would be expected to be fully functional by June 30th of 2024. So they are building in a little bit of time for that implementation to happen. We also wanted to highlight South Carolina Senate Bill 1115. This one did fail to move forward and would have established the Department of South Carolina First Steps to School Readiness. This one is interesting because it would take an existing program, the South Carolina First Steps to School Readiness program, and it would turn it into a department that would provide for a director to serve as the chief executive officer and administrative head of the First Steps to School Readiness, and would provide requirements for the director relating to the First Steps to School Readiness, and would allow for contracting with private nonprofit foundations to financially help support the efforts of the First Steps program. It would also designate this, as I mentioned, as an agency rather than an initiative, and pull in several other child-serving programs as part of that process. One thing I want to notice that you may have already noticed over the last 2 slides is that in recent years, one of the big conversational trends that we're seeing is states looking more at this CREATE approach and housing more children serving programs and services under a single department or agency or cabinet. And this trend goes beyond just a consideration of early childhood services and programs. And that brings me to the next slide. We wanted to share an example of a state that has recently considered making a larger shift to having a Department of Child and Family Services. So this takes it beyond just the boundaries of early childhood and looks more holistically at a department that serves all children and their families. This Senate Bill 414 would have established a Department of Child and Family Services that would include child welfare, child care, early learning, and more. Part of the rationale for this bill to be introduced was a series of tragedies related to children in the child welfare system that fell through the cracks and just had very tragic outcomes. So one of the goals here was to make improvements so that children are not falling through the cracks and experiencing bad outcomes. Ultimately, the Joint Committee of Health and Human Services opted to make a recommendation of ought not to pass on this bill. In the conversation, it wasn't so much that anyone was opposed to this proposal. However, the committee decided that more time was needed to see if some ongoing efforts within the administration would be successful in improving outcomes and implementing the prevention strategies to resolve those problems. But we wanted to highlight some of the benefits and challenges that came up during the course of this consideration, because they really do relate to some of those big picture considerations that states can think through if they're considering a move to a more holistic approach to child and family services. So some of the benefits that were expected with Department of Child and Family Services related to improvements to child safety overall, addressing some existing silos where the state of Maine was experiencing communication barriers to coordinating child services that were resulting in some children falling through the cracks. And the expectation was that this more holistic approach to child and family services would be responsive to promoting child well-being more broadly, as well as making sure that families were also experiencing high levels of well-being. Some of the challenges, though, are determining what all would be included. Because as we know, child policy often relates to other policy areas. Some of it is more closely aligned with health policy. Other policy may be more closely aligned with criminal and civil judicial policy, as in the case of juvenile justice. And then, of course, early learning and early childcare is often very closely associated with education policy. So determining what to pull out of other agencies and include in a new department like this can be a challenge. Related to that, there are many logistical challenges that come up when you're thinking about this, and it would require a lengthy transition because of all of those moving parts. The committee in this case also brought up the challenge that it would require additional legislation to pass that would really focus on what that transition process looks like. One final note on this example, there was quite a bit of testimony, both written and verbal, that came in from stakeholders and constituents in the state, and it was largely supportive of this effort. So this is certainly a conversation that we expect more states will have, as I mentioned before, given the sea change that's happening around child welfare right now. I think many more people are starting to consider what the implications of that are as they start linking these prevention policies that relate more to early learning or more to things like housing and other economic supports for families, and bringing that into communication with the child welfare system. On that note, we can move to the next slide, Allison, and Allison will introduce some policy considerations to bring us back to that 30,000-foot view.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, we started a while ago talking with 6 buckets, highlighting what we see as the reason that states might embark on such a conversation to change early childhood governance. And so over the next 2 slides, we just want to leave you with some thoughts, policy considerations, where you might go from here. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, so feel free to consider what else you might add. So the first one is really, is the state clear on its overall priorities for the early childhood system? So has the state identified priorities? Those are my dogs, I apologize. Has the state identified priorities? And is everyone in agreement of what those priorities are? Then what process should the state use to determine whether or not a governance change is needed to meet those stated objectives? So does the process engage a wide range of stakeholders, which I think from a lot of our examples you heard, that stakeholders including partners, state government, customers of state government, communities, providers, families, and so forth. What functions will the state need to perform to achieve these priorities? So do leaders have a shared understanding of the core function of early childhood system? And is the political will there for change? How should different levels of government work together to execute the critical function? And that's a big one. How can roles be defined to support success at every level? And have legislators communicated with all relevant stakeholders and constituents, cabinet and program leads that might influence a successful outcome? With that, I'm going to pass it to Jill, who's going to share 4 additional policy considerations that are a bit more nuanced and related to the potential implementation.
Thanks. So the first of these more nuanced policy considerations is personnel. This would include a focus or discussion around the leadership needs and the capacity in multiple roles needed for states to be successful with making transitions in early childhood governance or child governance more broadly. This might include a consideration of political, managerial, and other staff, and a recognition or discussion around how the skills needed at each level may be different. The next is the configuration. This is looking at the capacities needed at the state level within that the administration to achieve the state's goals, and what is the ideal configuration of that capacity. Something to consider under configuration is the state's focus on what range of ages ought to be served under the new governance strategy. Would it be birth to 5, birth to 8, prenatal to 3, birth to 25? And also a consideration of whether the state is focused on early care and education, things like preschool, childcare, Head Start, or on a broader set of services that reach children and their families more broadly. Next is thinking about creating success. And this is really around looking and thinking through some of those logistical challenges that may be encountered through the implementation process. So if a decision is made to change governance strategies, how should the state manage the process of governance change? How does it actually come into being in a way that's likely to be successful? And what capacities are needed for that process to be successful? For example, you might consider, has the state looked at the cost of the process change? How realistic is the state's timeline for that transition? And what is the political climate and any potential turf wars if you opt to pull existing programs out of the offices or divisions that they're currently in into a new agency? And finally is a cost-benefit analysis. We all know that government services can be costly. And one of the things that is important to ensuring or setting the groundwork for success is ensuring that the cost benefit of the change is aligned. So things like thinking through, what are the costs of the transition? And is the state building the needed capacity to support the success? Is this an unfunded mandate? Those sorts of questions. So Allison, to transition us more to some next steps, would you share some ideas for what legislators can do if they're considering governance changes?
I sure would. I meant to mention also the previous 2 slides are the information within is part of a report that came out in 2020 related to governance, and there's a discussion guide. And so that's linked in our slides later on, but that could be a helpful tool. So everyone in the room, if you start thinking about creating, consolidating, or coordinating child serving programs, the question is what could be like, what can I do? What's next? So a few things. Please do access our resources. We have the Early Childhood Legislative Database that updates on a weekly basis, includes introduced, pending, and enacted legislation, all related to advisory councils and boards, study committees, and other bodies. So that's where our legislative examples from today come from. Also, we have our Child Welfare Enacted Legislative Database. Remember that we can help connect you with policymakers and experts in the field. We are here to support you. So we could set up meetings, we could share additional information, we can help connect you with the commissioners in other states or policymakers who have been part of the debate in their state, which can often be a great way to learn information. Think about setting up meetings with officials in Kentucky. This might include individuals that are department heads, program administrators, school officials. Hear what's working and what's not working. See what folks boots on the ground have to say could be an improvement or what really doesn't need improvement. Listening to families, I think that talking to parents and grandparents and other stakeholders can really be illuminating and could inform your thinking. And then just deepening your understanding of what exists out there. This could also be if you have a children's cabinet attending a meeting or a coordinating counselor or a legislative children's caucus meeting. In closing, I think it's important to realize that changing oversight and administration of any program takes time. It's not a silver bullet or the only solution to early childhood troubles. But as a member of NCSL from New Mexico once said to me, you need knowledgeable champions committed for the long haul to ensure that during the first 5 years of life, children experience a safe, secure, healthy start with robust family and educator supports and services. We'll leave you with a handful of resources, both internal and external, throughout our presentation. There are links to all the bills, so you can access that. And I'd be remiss not to briefly highlight our fellowship programs at NCSL. We have an Early Childhood Fellows Program and a Child Welfare Fellows Program. If anyone would be interested in learning more, we'd love to share that with you. Senator Carroll, as an alum of early childhood, could certainly answer questions too. Jill, why don't you tell us about these 3 events?
Sure thing. So another service that NCSL provides is to host national convenings periodically throughout the year. And the next 3 that are coming up, we have Base Camp next month in mid-November. This one is primarily offered online and is often highly attended by legislative staff. So keep in mind that legislative staff can build their own expertise through these opportunities as well. In December, we have Legislative Forecast, where NCSL staff will talk about legislative trends in 2022 and what we expect to see in the legislative sessions next year. And then next summer, we'll have our annual Legislative Summit in Indianapolis. All of these opportunities provide more chances or opportunities to make connections across states and for legislators and legislative staff to learn from each other and what is and is not working in different states. And Allison?
Yes, we went over our time. I apologize, but we are here for you. Ask us questions now. If we don't know answers, we will certainly do whatever research is required, and we can send a memo to Senator Carroll to pass around or whatever is convenient for folks. But we do have certainly time for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Allison and Jill. And I just to kind of kick this off, these efforts to where these states are moving to different governing models, are those coming as a result of trying to expand childcare quality, improve quality, or is it more of a combination of issues dealing in the field of early childhood?
I think, and Jill, please jump in. My sense is states enter in on these conversations for a few reasons. I do think that childcare access, affordability, and quality maybe help drive people faster to the decision. I also think that the pandemic really drove a lot of interest in thinking about how systems that serve young children are working or not working for families. So I think it's a little bit of each. I don't know, Jill, if you have a different perspective.
I'll just add to that. So I focus more on the child welfare and child maltreatment prevention space, but we do also track governance-related legislation in our database. And we often see this type of legislation in response to some sort of a problem. Some part of the system is not working as well as the legislature wants it to, or perhaps they're hearing from constituents about certain problem areas. Maybe they're noticing trends, such has been certainly common the last couple years in retaining a workforce or struggling with the rising costs of providing services. So there's a lot of different reasons that might prompt a state to begin these conversations.
Okay.
It is often around wanting to improve access and quality of services offered to children and families.
And I think that's what caught my attention so quickly was just, the enormity of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services in Kentucky. It's easy for one division or one department to get lost. And I guess as we try to focus on building a more efficient, more effective early childhood education system within the Commonwealth, my thoughts were that this idea of having a cabinet that focused specifically on children, early childhood, that we could move quicker in that area, and there would, perhaps get more attention through the executive branch and the legislative branch, and maybe provide more support and more efficiency in those efforts. Any comments?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that part of the reason we pulled out the bill from Maine that Jill spent so much time talking about was because, Senator Carroll, when we spoke earlier in the month and you had mentioned innovative, that example really struck us as something somewhat innovative because it is early childhood, yes, but also thinking more holistically. And it doesn't seem that a lot of states are having legislation like that. Now, whether or not they're talking about it at the state level, we can't know that at this point. But bolstering and drawing attention to early childhood programs in conjunction with child welfare or helping prevent child maltreatment is, I want to call it innovative. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but I think.
Okay.
I think you do get extra attention when you pull something out and it is its own cabinet level. I would caution you that you also want to make sure you have the right person that's heading it. Right? I mean, it would be interesting over time to see what those 8 states and potentially if New Jersey moves in the direction of creating something, once they have an appointed commissioner, is that the right person to help elevate the importance of these programs?
Okay. And and I understand that some people would have concerns about bigger government, and I'm one of those people. I don't really want to see bigger government, but we have really, Sarah, if you can come to the table also, if you don't mind, please. In looking what's happened in the Commonwealth the last couple of years, it's just the importance of this in our state has just grown exponentially. And is it to that level to where it deserves that kind of focus? And we have seen some major flaws in our system that basically brought this state to its knees. And, that's what we're trying to make sure that we prepare for. And if you all would please hold on, I have asked Dr. Vanover, who is the former director of the Division of Child Care, and Andrea Day, who is the current director. I have both of them at the table. And I don't want to get into any details. And if there's something I ask you're not comfortable with, please tell me that you're not. But in looking at the way that we function now with the Division of Child Care being under the cabinet, and I would assume that there, in the areas that, in other departments that affect early childhood, that there's a coordination that occurs. And then I'm curious to what your opinions would be if this issue is such that, do you feel like that we could be more effective if we had a cabinet for early childhood? Sarah, we'll start with you.
Okay. I can say that I understand the current structure and why we were placed in that current structure and how it was set up, because the Child Care and Development Block Grant has a great deal of subsidy-based funds that fits well with the types of subsidy funding that DCBS does with TANF and WIC and Medicaid and those types of things. And so that's a program system that is very smooth, well, as smooth as possible based on the amount of money and the number of people applying. The downfall with that is that it does often alienate Division of Child Care from Department of Ed. And so you feel a different strain between child care and education, and sometimes it's more of a respect level that our child care providers are not getting the same level of respect and training and things like that in Department of Ed. I can say from somebody who has been employed at the state and no longer, the Division of Child Care and the Division of Early Learning at Department of Ed have a great working relationship. And I feel like they are excellent colleagues, but there are things that they can't necessarily partner on as easily because they're within separate silos. And the same thing happens with First Steps and Hands within the health and wellness part of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. Again, there's a great working relationship. I think all these organizations come together at the Early Childhood Advisory Council, but they're kind of alienated in some ways too. Now, again, the alienation was initially put there because the funding streams do have specific purposes. But we have seen states where they've been able to bring all those under one house and make those funding streams stay true to their original source, but blend programs together. And I'm going to agree with Allison. Specifically, it has a lot to do with the leadership and whoever is leading those programs. People like Stephen Hicks in Maryland that know all the regulations and all the rules as the superintendent of early childhood there, and he can make sure that those programs stay true to the funding source, but then partner together. And that's what you want to see for it to do well.
Yeah, I think there's a great collaboration, and there's been more collaboration in the last.
Andrea, please introduce yourself. For the record.
I'm sorry. Andrea Day, Director for the Division of Child Care. There's been greater collaboration. I joined the Division of Child Care 5 years ago, and compared to how we operated then to how we operate now, it's leaps and bounds better. We are part of the Department for Community-Based Services, which houses not only the Division of Child Care, the Division of Family Support, and our Public Child Welfare Agency, the Division for Protection and Permanency, the Division of Service Region, and that's our frontline staff. So we meet on a regular basis, and we are collaborating, and with recent legislation as far as Families First and prevention work, there's more of a focus on how we can better communicate with each other and collaborate to where we're getting the biggest impact for our dollars, especially with prevention.
Representative Raymond, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask about the Governor's Office of Early Childhood and where it fits in. I know Amy Neal is here. Where it fits in, how it works with both KDE and CHFS, and how it does or doesn't look like some of the examples we saw in the NCSL presentation.
Come on up, Amy. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Hi, I'm Amy Neal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Governor's Office of Early Childhood. And Kentucky is a coordinated system of governance. And the Early Childhood Advisory Council The Governor's Office of Early Childhood serves as the support office for the Advisory Council. And our role, Kentucky has really 3 different oversight entities where early childhood sits and invests. 3 different entities: the Kentucky Department of Education, the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, and the Education and Labor Cabinet. So when you're thinking about fragmented services, programming, strategies, people, that's a coordinated system of governance. Does that help, Representative?
How do you think it's working?
Well, so it's all about relationships. So, you can move people around and chairs around, and you can still not have great coordination. Or you can move people and chairs around and you can have great coordination. So, I'm with Andrea that, and Sarah actually, that we have great relationships and we do all come together at the Early Childhood Advisory Council, right? We do all work together. So I will say, so I've been here 2.5 years, and it is my first stint in state government, and I've worked in early childhood for over 20 years. And I think the beauty of the Early Childhood Advisory Council is we're the only office that is thinking about the entire continuum, birth through 5. We don't provide direct services, and so we're not just thinking public preschool, Head Start, home visitation, or childcare. We're thinking about the entire comprehensive system and thinking about how every child in the Commonwealth can have high-quality early learning experiences. And I do think that that is critical, that you have that neutral agency, an entity where you're convening everyone in the Commonwealth, where you're looking out for that one goal of ensuring that every child has a high-quality experience so that, all families are supported, all children have a strong start, and that, the economy is thriving in Kentucky.
I will say that the difference, and Amy described the office very well, so I appreciate that. The difference in what we looked at in some of these more created offices versus the Kentucky current model is that although the Early Childhood Advisory Council meets quarterly, it does a great job of bringing everybody to the table. The individual offices go back at the end of the day and they make more decisions based on their individual needs. So, KDE, Division of Child Care, HANDS, everybody comes to the table at those quarterly meetings like they will next week. And they have a great discussion based on everything, but they return to their world at the end of the day. When you have these created collaborative offices, it's somebody coordinating this that says, as we make decisions, we do this all together. Right now with DCC, Andrea mentioned that Division of Child Care meets weekly, regularly with DCBS, with the Division of Family Support, all that. DCC and KDE don't get that regular sit down the same way that the other collaborative offices within her cabinet do. And there is partnership, and I think we have great partnerships. Mm-hmm. Amy's right. There's a lot of really great relationships. Mm-hmm. But because everybody is tasked so individually within the state, outside of those collaborative meetings, there's still a great return to your individual priorities. And at times that's necessary. If I am Andrea and she's got to figure out how to supervise all the licensed and certified child care programs in the state, then she's going to have to make some of those individual decisions. But if we're looking at things like mixed model delivery and children that need whole services and things like that, it's harder just to come together once a quarter and think about policies that could wrap around children as much.
Okay, we're going to need to move on. One more question, Senator Wilson. We've got another group of presenters.
Thank you. I'll try to make it brief here. My question is, with all of this collaboration between the 3 different areas, who has the oversight to child care centers as far as inspections, as far as enforcement, and all of that goes? Who is responsible for that when you get together and put all this requirements together? Who enforces
The
that?
Division of Child Care holds all the regs, and we contract with the Office of Inspector General, Division of Regulated Child Care. They have staff that go out to do the inspections, to follow up on complaints, to do the initial application and survey the centers, and they are our enforcers, if you will. They go out and make sure that our regulations are followed and that health and safety standards are met.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Carroll, may I just add one more
Yes,
thing?
please.
I think just one other thing to keep in mind that is, it's very hard to do, but it's very critical, and it's a neutral piece, is data. And we talked earlier about kindergarten readiness data. We talked earlier about third grade proficiency data. And there are milestones and like indicators that we have in the early childhood space. For example, the quality rating system and the indicators of quality. And so the more we're all sort of rowing in the same direction with that shared accountability, the better it is for kids and families. And so I just sort of flag that for us to consider when we're trying to ensure that more kids show up for kindergarten prepared, because that's all of our responsibility.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Allison and Jill, thank you both so much for joining us today and for the information. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again. There's some other areas that I want to look at. I'm going to check out some of the data that you all have first and kind of get more familiar with that. But I want to make it clear to those who are watching on KET that we are not saying that we are going to present legislation to create a cabinet for children. The topics that we bring up in these meetings are for discussion. It is to provide information to make decisions in the future. There are no decisions that have been made. So, and I think it's important for us to look at this issue from every angle that we possibly can to come up with the best policy. And there may be things that are controversial, things that I don't agree with, things that other members of this committee don't agree with, but it's still good to hear those things so we can get a good, clear picture before we do make decisions. Okay, now we are going to move on to the Federal Food, Adult and Children's Food Program. And I want to just take a minute to thank Michelle Wallace with KB's Kids Zone in Owensboro. I was emailing with her the other day in a conversation, and she brought this up, and it is a component of early childhood education within our centers that is important. It addresses the profitability, the quality of services, the basic functions of a center are tied to this. I know in our center we have a staff of 3 in our food program, and it's a very important part of what we do quality-wise and to help cover the cost of feeding the kids through this program. And so I thought it was important for the committee to hear what this program is about and how it relates to the different centers, which centers are eligible to participate in this. Is this something we want to look at as part of the future of early childhood education, something we want to invest in as a state to make sure that every child in a licensed center has a free meal? I know there's legislation in one state, and I think Michelle sent me something that was proposed that basically for every licensed center is provided funding for food, and it was a piece of legislation that was filed. I think it was California, if I read the article correctly. But this is about the federal food program, and so this is important, and it is something that many centers do deal with. And please introduce yourself for the record. And is it just you today?
Yes.
Okay, you have the floor.
My name is Elizabeth Feeler.
Turn your microphone on. And I appreciate what you do. You are always helpful.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Feeler. I'm a registered dietitian, and I'm the manager of the Child and Adult Care Food Program. Do you have my PowerPoint? Can I just stick, oh, it should be on here?
She said it's on the laptop, so it
Okay.
should be there. Can someone assist?
I found it.
Got
Thank
it?
you so
Okay.
much. Okay. Well. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go over like an overview, but if you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask. The purpose of the Child and Adult Care Food Program is to assist centers that are eligible, and I'll discuss who all is eligible, in providing nutritious meals. So essentially, if you provide a meal that follows the guidelines, you can submit a claim to the state agency and we'll reimburse you based on rates that are set by Congress each year. So I'll show you what those are too. But there's several different types of centers that can qualify. It could be, of course, a child care center, a daycare home, so any in-home daycare that is registered, certified, or licensed, a Head Start, after-school programs. I'll talk a little bit more about what qualifies as an at-risk after-school program. We do serve emergency shelters, so any emergency shelter or homeless shelter that has families. So it has to be a shelter that actually takes in the mom or the dad and the children, because we're going to serve the children while they're at the center. And it's for reimbursement. So this program was started initially with the National School Lunch Act. It's reauthorized under the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. The United States Department of Agriculture is the federal agency, Food and Nutrition Services. Our regulation is 7 CFR Part 226, and of course it's administered by the Kentucky Department of Education, where I work. So the eligible sites that I just mentioned, I've listed them all here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the eligibility for each site type, and I'll try to emphasize the things that are very specific to the child care centers. So for child care centers, we can reimburse for meals up to the age of 12, 15 for migrant workers, or 18 for mentally or physically disabled. The meal reimbursement rates are determined in child cares by the household income, and I'll show you what that income is. It changes also every year, and it's updated annually. Child cares may serve 2 meals and a snack. So most typically what we see is they'll serve breakfast, lunch, and snack, and then they provide to us the numbers of breakfast, lunch, and snacks that they provided and the eligibility. So how many free, reduced, and paid rate children that they have. 2 meals and a snack is currently the max of what can be served. You could potentially do 2 snacks and a meal if you preferred. For-profit agencies versus nonprofit agencies. So nonprofit agencies are eligible to receive reimbursement at the rates based on the household incomes for all their children. If it's a for-profit center, they must first be able to show us that they have at least 25% of their children that will be eligible for free and reduced meals. So it is possible that for-profit centers will not qualify based on that specific requirement. The at-risk after-school program, this is going to be a lot of your programs like the YMCA or different programs that are available in the schools to provide care after the school ends but before the parents come to pick them up. This is also going to be all of your after-school enrichment programs like tutoring, band, that sort of thing. So this offers 1 meal and 1 snack, and it's up to the agency what they decide to serve. This can be nonprofit agencies, it can be school districts, any agency that has an after-school program. So, maybe libraries, like I said, YMCA programs. There's a lot of variety of possibilities. We do also have at-risk programs that are in churches. So as long as it's served outside of the school day, during the school year, because of course during the summer program would pick that up, and it's up to the age of 18, and they can serve 1 meal and 1 snack, and all is reimbursed at the free rate. So the reason it's referred to as the at-risk after-school program is it's only available in areas where the local school has 50% free or reduced. So it's based off of, an elementary school or a middle school that's in the area that has at least 50% free or reduced. Emergency shelters, we can serve up to age 18 typically, but there is a waiver right now through COVID that allows us to serve up through age 24. And the emergency shelter can serve 3 meals, so typically they're going to serve breakfast, lunch, and supper, and all meals are reimbursed at the free rate. Head Start and state-funded preschools. Head Starts are all going to be reimbursed at the free rate because being eligible for Head Start automatically qualifies a child for a higher reimbursement rate. State-funded preschools are going to be based on household income. They can serve 2 meals and a snack per day, which typically we'll see breakfast, lunch, and afternoon snack. Adult daycare centers can participate in the program if they do not participate in the Older Americans Act.
Let's just skip that.
Okay,
please.
sure.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So family daycare homes, that's in-home daycare. It's very similar to child cares, the up to age 12, 2 meals and a snack, that sort of thing. There is a slightly different reimbursement rate for tiering.
Explain with the family daycare homes. Is that,
Those are going to be daycare.
I mean, all of those are for-profit.
Yes, you're correct.
So they don't have to meet any of the criteria that
You're
are
right.
for-profit?
They don't have to be, we don't even look at whether they're, whether they're considered profit or, they're eligible as long as they're licensed, registered, or certified.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Good questions. So this is one of the things that will help understand eligibility. So if we get a call from a center that says, I'd like to learn about the food program, we tell them all the details of who's eligible, what type of center you have to be, that sort of thing. And then they have 2 routes that they can go. They can either go under a current existing sponsoring organization that would provide services to them, such as training, monitoring, technical assistance, and then they submit their paperwork to that sponsoring organization, and that sponsoring organization then pays them directly. State agency pays the sponsoring organization pays the child care. The other option is for them to come on with the state agency directly. And when they call, they're given both options, and they're told, think about your options and let us know what you want to do. The only exception is family daycare homes. They do have to go under a sponsoring org, and that's a federal requirement. So one of the things to understand better the sponsoring org is that the sponsor organization is the one who is responsible with the state agency. So when we monitor to make sure that everybody's following the rules, we're holding that sponsoring organization accountable. So if a center gets in trouble and has to pay back some money, we actually bill the sponsoring organization because it's the sponsoring organization's responsibility to ensure compliance. At that point, the sponsoring org is required to do that. Now, one of the things that is sometimes a deterrent for the child care centers is that the sponsoring org can take up to 15% of the meal reimbursement off the top for the purpose of serving that child care center.
Okay. Can you kind of give some examples, like for a family daycare home?
Yes.
Who would they get to be their sponsoring agency?
Well, that's a good question. We have 4Cs out of Louisville. We have a couple of nonprofit agencies that actually come out of Tennessee and serve our state. But typically it's going to be an agency that already provides some sort of early childhood services. Like maybe they participate in the child care assistance program, or they have grants to provide education for child cares.
Okay. So would we have any authority as a state to change that if let's say we wanted the family daycare homes to be able to provide that service and keep their own paperwork, submit it. Could we change that as a state?
No, unfortunately not. Not for the family daycare homes. Now, for the child cares, like a typical child care, they do have the choice whether they go under sponsoring or they go independent. So I guess in theory, the state could change that. I've not ever looked into that.
Yeah, I don't guess I've ever heard of one going through another agency like we do our own.
Yes.
And it is a headache with the paperwork, but it's
It is.
worthwhile.
Yes, exactly. So this next section is kind of the reason why some centers might decide to go under a sponsoring org. With this federal requirements, we are required when somebody calls and asks to be on the program, if they want to work directly and have a contract directly with us, they have to provide financial and administrative capability. So we have to look at their financial records to make sure that they are in good financial standing. We have to look at their processes, what kind of staffing they have, what kind of the integrity of their business practices. We really have to look at a lot of those sorts of things, and sometimes the child cares struggle with providing those financial records and providing some of the requirements that we have from the federal level. And if that's the case, that's when they can go under that sponsoring org. That's a common reason that they do. Now, some may prefer to go under a sponsoring org where they have a little bit more oversight, that sort of thing. But typically what happens is it's difficult for them to pass this financial and administrative capability process that we have to do. And so that gives them another alternative, is to go under a sponsoring organization. So I did provide some data on what types of sites we have. So you'll see for licensed child care centers, we have 709. We have 238 Head Start, 634 at-risk after-school programs, and 216 home day care centers. Our average daily attendance for federal year 21 was 2593 for the child care centers, or 25,935 for the child care centers, and 34,402 for the at-risk after school. I did include this data because it kind of shows you how COVID has affected our child care centers' participation and our average daily attendance. As you can see, in 2019 pre-COVID, we had quite a bit higher average daily attendance than we did at the end of 2021. I'll be curious to see how 2022 has shaped up comparatively, but I thought that the average daily attendance was very interesting. Now, we have a lot less centers in 2021, but I think the attendance at each of those centers got a little better as things begin to adapt.
And what is the total number of centers in 2021?
The total number of child care centers was 709.
Okay, those served, Sarah, or
Oh, that's the CACFP centers, I'm sorry.
okay, what is the total, Andrea?
I'm
What
not-
the total number of child care centers? How many did not participate in this?
Over half didn't participate.
Okay, come on. I'm sorry. And this committee is getting a little informal, and I apologize. But if you're going to learn anything, you've got to ask the right people.
It would be over half didn't participate because, and I apologize that I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I think at one time it was 1,619 centers. So based on these numbers, that was at a low point, but still.
And I think just one thing to point out that might make it a little bit hard to compare is the state-funded preschools and the Head Starts are often licensed, and we consider those in a separate category. So that may be something we could look into on how to compare. So we had 238 Head Starts that participated, 709 child cares, which actually the child cares would include our state-funded preschools and our licensed child cares, but our Head Starts would be separate. So that, still probably less than half.
And I can pull those numbers and share those with this committee.
Okay. And as you're covering this, keep in mind that we're looking at this as an element of growing childcare throughout the state as a funding stream, not really a profit funding stream, because we lose money in our food program every month, but as a way to improve quality and help with some of the expenses. So please continue. I'm sorry I keep
Yeah,
interrupting.
no problem. So the funding, like I said, is once the sponsor's approved and they serve credible meals and they keep the proper paperwork, they can file a claim each month. That claim is paid through our state agency. With regard to reimbursement, here's some of the breakdown numbers. CACFP total in FY21 was $45 million. The child cares, which is going to include your state-funded preschools and your child cares, would be about $19 million, $19.7 million. The at-risk after-school, which also is going to include some of your licensed child cares, because some of those after-school YMCA programs are going to be licensed child care centers. You can see the numbers here in our Head Start. So I broke that out for you. These are approximate numbers based on our FY 2021, because we don't typically break down our site types like this for funding, but we will definitely work on doing that for the future so that you all can have that information. So here is your reimbursement rates. So you can see that a free lunch is going to be $4.03. A reduced lunch is going to be $3.63, and a paid lunch is going to be 47 cents. So you can see the reimbursement and how that works out. For the in-home child cares, which is the daycare home line, it's going to be based on your tier. And tier is based on, tier 1 would be area eligible, which would be based on that free and reduced percentage from the local school like I talked about earlier. And tier 2, if you're not area eligible and you're an in-home daycare, you can do income applications for your children to see what your rate is. Now, right now, you'll notice that all the rates for tier 1 and tier 2 are the same. Tier 2 is typically higher, but because of COVID, we actually have a waiver to serve every in-home daycare as a tier 1, which means they get the higher pay rate. Income eligibility, this is probably very similar to an income eligibility that you're used to seeing, but this is what we would use to determine if a child care has 20 kids, how many fell into the free category, how many fell into the paid category, and how many were in the reduced category. And then once they get those numbers, their reimbursement is based on that. So of course they have documentation. We've tried to, over the past few years, really try to reduce that paperwork and make that paperwork as simple as possible. Do as much electronic as we can. So our goal is to make that easier, and we do take recommendations from our sponsors. As far as the nutrition requirements, I do have the information in here, but just so that you're aware, it aligns with WIC, it aligns with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans and the American Academy of Pediatrics. So when the federal CACFP came up with the guidelines, those were the things they were looking at. Do they meet all of these guidelines? Do you want me to go through? I've got the meal patterns in here so you can see what's expected. For breakfast, you have to have 3 components. For lunch, you have to have 5 components. And for snack, you have to have 2. So that kind of gives you an idea. So for snack, you could do a fruit and crackers or fruit and cheese or something like that. 2 components. So I think that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I know there's also funding through this, like we put a garden in for our kids.
That's right.
And there's funding
Yes.
that through this program that helps cover those types of activities. Let's get into a little bit, and Sarah, you may want to jump in on this also. Let's talk about those centers who do not qualify for the program. And Andrea, if you want to speak to this first, what do they have? What are the requirements of those centers in relation to feeding their kids? Yeah, Andrea, you will not come to another meeting, will you?
I will not. No.
After legislation that was passed in 2020, the bill stated that all child care programs had to have the meal components in alignment with the federal food program. So our child care programs, even if they're not doing the paperwork for reimbursement, they are feeding children in a similar manner. Now, in alignment means there's a little bit of flexibility there. The only thing that is not in the child care regulations regarding the rules that Ms. Feeler talked about is a very specific breakdown of portion sizes. But the meal components, the difference in whole wheat versus white bread and all that kind of stuff, it's a very extensive portion of our health and safety regs. So there is alignment with all the child care programs. However, some programs can't get the same reimbursement that others can, as Ms. Feeler stated. And depending on how much time it takes you to fill out the paperwork, as you mentioned, it can be quite extensive. Some programs don't participate in the federal food program because the children that they serve, the income level of the children that are enrolled would not get the type of reimbursement that they want from that. But there are many groups like Head Start programs. In order to be a Head Start program, you must participate in the federal food program. If you don't, you lose your status as a Head Start program. So there are some that are very specifically enrolled and others that are meeting the meal planning component but may not be participating in the paperwork. And that shift happened in 2021 when our licensing surveyors in the state of Kentucky began to inspect on that, which previously they had never inspected more than just making sure that 2 components, 3 components, or 5 components were being served at a time. But they did when the regulations changed. The staff from the Division of Regulated Child Care do now look to see that they are in alignment with the federal food program. However, if there are more advanced nutrition questions, they do usually defer to Ms. Feeler's office.
They contact us, if they have questions, but also if it is an agency or a site that participates in the food program, they refer it to us often because we can do, a lot more extensive. We're used to doing a lot more extensive. So we've actually really appreciated that relationship and working together. So Sarah mentioned that, some of the daycare centers may not see it as feasible to participate. So for example, if it's a nonprofit and they have, let's say they have 50 kids and 30 of them are going to fall in that paid rate, they're not going to get enough funds for it to be feasible for them to participate. And so that's a decision that they make, and that's up to them.
But they still have to provide a meal.
They
meals.
do, you're right. And
they still have to fall within those.
They do. Yeah, the only difference would be they don't have to keep our record keeping, where you have to keep the head counts and the meal counts and keep your menus and your receipts and things like that.
Now, there are child care programs that do not provide meals during the day. And in those cases, they ask the families to bring in the meals. If it's a half-day program, they might provide a snack. But if it is a full-day program and they say, we provide snacks, but you have to bring a lunchbox with your meals, which there's a good percentage that do that. Their regulations do not have to meet this level. They have their own separate set of regulations. However, even if the parent brings the meal and packs a lunch, then the center is required to make sure that packed lunch meets the meal requirements. So if a child, I had an example a few years ago when I was at a program where the parents sent the meal in and all they did was send a giant croissant, like the size of the child's head. And so the program was responsible for finding a fruit, a vegetable, a protein, and the milk to supplement that. And so most of those programs really try to partner closely with the parents to make sure that they send in those requirements, because on days when you have a child who brings in a giant croissant, then you're responsible for finding everything else at lunchtime to make sure that the child has a proper meal.
And we do have some centers that do a combination, like they'll have the parents bring in the lunch because that requires 5 components in our program. and then they'll get reimbursed for breakfast and snack, because breakfast is 3 components and snack is 2. And you can do some shelf stable items. You can do milk, cereal, and a fruit for breakfast. So there is ways to do a combination, and we do see some that do that.
So if you qualify for the food program, you have 25%. You meet that threshold.
Right.
What's the deciding factor as to whether or not you want to participate? At what point is it best for you to participate?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I will say, a lot of times we get resistance from centers because they think it's going to be harder than it is. Maybe they participated 10 years ago when things were a lot less efficient and more handwriting than now. We've got a lot of electronic documents that will add things up. And so we really try to talk to people about it's gotten a lot easier. We'll help you through it. So we're seeing a little bit more of a more willingness, but I think some of it is just the fear of keeping all the paperwork. The other thing is we are punitive, which means if you don't do it right, you have to pay us back, and that can sometimes deter.
Those are federal rules.
That's
correct?
right, yes.
Okay.
And there was initial pushback when we first put this regulation into play, because one of the biggest things was centers wanted to have parties. They wanted to have birthday party celebrations or holiday party celebrations, and they felt like participating in the federal food program would limit that. What they didn't realize is that they still have that opportunity. They just can't be reimbursed for some of those snack foods that are not covered by the federal food program. So some of it was misinformation that caused a great deal of pushback.
That's really not an issue.
No,
we
it's
don't
not.
struggle with.
No, if you want to have a party on a day, just don't claim those meals. Don't include those in your claim, or serve the creditable meal and serve the party items as extras.
And the
So-
other thing is staffing. If you're a director and you're in a classroom all day long, you don't have anybody to fill out additional paperwork. And so it might not just be feasible until they can get a full staff.
And I think that's one of the biggest reasons we've seen as our numbers have decreased during COVID is staffing. Getting a cook in there that can do the menu, having somebody who can consistently, we're doing annual renewals of our applications right now, and just getting the sponsors to complete the application. Some of our staff have called centers 15 times to get them just to go in the system and hit the button. They're just so shorthanded.
I'm going to have to go home and tell my food staff how much I appreciate them. How much, let's kind of look at this a different way. How does this play into our ability to grow child care centers in the state? What can we do in this area to make this better? One, for the quality of care, making sure kids are getting proper meals, and then two, the cost aspect of that could, it all plays into for private centers. If they can't turn a profit, they're not going to open, and there's nothing wrong. They should be able to turn a profit. Mm-hmm. But how can we make this aspect of child care centers better in looking at it that angle to grow centers throughout the Commonwealth?
I don't think that centers realize how much technical assistance and support they can get from Ms. Feeler's office if they do participate in this program. They assume that they're going to have to learn how to do all this on their own, and a great deal of time is dedicated to supporting them. Since centers already have to meet the meal planning requirements, as soon as they cross that paperwork threshold, Ms. Feeler's office can begin to offer them a great deal of support that the Division of Child Care and Division of Regulatory Child Care cannot offer. And there are a lot of misconceptions, like about parties and things like that centers offer pushback on, and they just don't have the full picture of what the program is and what they're offering.
We have a lot of very passionate staff, and it's great the amount of work that they will go through to try to help people. We do, when somebody first comes on, we do one-on-one training with them. We work with them one-on-one until they're comfortable. Before they ever file their first claim, we sit down with them at their location and help them combine that claim, come up with the numbers, make sure it's accurate. I mean, we really try to work with them. And then if they struggle for that first month, we'll come back a second month and we'll help them.
I wish I knew how prevalent it is that there are centers that just don't do this, and I mean, they're not going to make any money by doing it, but it would cut their expenses tremendously, I'm sure. I wish I knew how many centers could benefit by this. Is there any way to,
I will
those
say,
that are eligible?
Yes, I will say that over the past few years, several times we have taken the list that we can generate from your website and highlight the ones that are not participating, divide it out amongst the staff, and the staff just call them. So we've done that several times. So, I mean, it's definitely something we'll do again. But right now, I think the biggest issue is staffing. You know, they're so scared to take on anything more because of the staffing issues. You know, like you said, one of the issues with our applications right now is many of our directors and owners are in classrooms making sure they're meeting ratio, so they're not able to sit in front of their computer and do their application like we need them to. So, but yeah, I feel like we do a lot to try to make sure people feel comfortable, but sometimes hearing it from somebody besides us who, you know, we may sound like we're trying to sell them the program. I know at one point, Lysander was putting in like new packets about the child care program, and I think we got quite a few that called us from that. So,
Okay. Are there, have you all received any word from the federal government that, I know there's a lot of talk about more and more money poured into child care, early childhood, about those restrictions changing or to make it a universal coverage? And I guess going along with it, I know aren't there school districts that the entire school gets free lunches, whether you qualify or not?
There are, and I don't know much about that part. I know my boss Lauren is here; she might know more about that. But there is a lot of talk about that. There is, and I don't know how far it will go because I'm not really in a position to know those pieces. But there is talk about using the area eligibility like they do with the at-risk after-school program. Which would eliminate those enrollment forms and income applications that they have to do every year, and it would allow everyone to be paid at the free rate. I mean, that's been discussed. So there's lots of talk like that. I just don't know, you know, how likely it is to happen. I will say that, you know, they're doing a lot of things to try to provide more reimbursement, like allowing all the family daycare homes to be enriched at the higher rate. They've added 10%. Or not 10%, 10 cents on the meal rates for this year. So there's lots of things that are being done. I see a lot of positive movement.
There's also some consideration that the National School Lunch Program, which is what K through 12 uses, is different than the program that child care uses. And when we have a preschool program in a public school system that chooses to be licensed as well, the child and adult family food program is more restrictive. If you go into a public school, my children can still have Pop-Tarts for breakfast there and be reimbursed for it. We're in a child care program that would not work. And we will look at all the federal money that has come down in the past 3 years for child care. It has been focused more on keeping the center operational and preventing closures as opposed to increasing quality, because everybody was just trying to hold on to the cliff by their fingernails. So it didn't look at increasing programs like federal food program, because it was more of how to sustain operations that were already in place instead of increasing quality.
There are restrictions that are in the child care centers, like unflavored milk is required for under age 6, no sweet grains, which is where it kind of throws out the Pop-Tarts. And the thought process there is trying to get, you know, children not used to those sweetened foods at a young age. So And that's new. All of that changed in 2017.
Okay. Any other thoughts from any of you in this area? And I think this is an important component. Quickly, are there states that supplement funding for these programs to make it more where all kids can get it? Are there state food programs that are
I'm
partners
not
with the
aware of
federal?
any.
Okay. And if there are child care owners out there who struggle with this, and I would love to hear from you on how this affects your ability to sustain your operation and what problems you have as we look at this component. So I have monopolized all of the questions today as usual. And Senator Thomas, would you like to ask a question or make a comment, sir?
Thank you for your thoughtfulness, Chairman Carroll. You're right, I've been unusually quiet today. I think sometimes you just have to go through a period of reflection and synthesis in order to move forward. And I think that's where I am today. I will say that I would definitely like to speak with Ms. May and with Dr. Vanover offline as we, when we adjourn.
Okay, anything you want to add? Our next meeting is November the 3rd, and this will be the final content meeting, and then we'll meet again on November 21st to discuss and vote for task force findings. And there will be decisions made as to where we go with this, whether or not it ends or we continue on to the next interim. I feel like there's a lot more that we need to cover, and I would really like to hear from more centers throughout the state before we really get into a lot of policy discussions. But some good information today, and we've come a long way, and there's still a lot to hear. But it's I think the thing that did me the most good was at your suggestion, meeting with some local providers and hearing from them from day to day and the struggles that they have. And I think that's really why I think we need more time to really hear more from them and get suggestions from them on things that we can do to help them to sustain and to grow throughout the Commonwealth. I don't know that the cabinet idea, I don't know, maybe that's something for the future, but if there is cooperation and there's communications, maybe that's not a weakness. Maybe we just need to make some adjustments in that area, but I don't know. But it was good to hear about that, and I appreciate the folks from NCSL. They're always a tremendous asset on anything that we're doing. Before we adjourn, is there anyone else in the audience who has a comment or a question that you would like to bring forward before we adjourn for the day? You go right ahead.
For those in the room, if any members would like to meet with local providers, the folks here via Mandy Simpson, and I'm sure anyone else in the room would be happy to facilitate those meetings for them. So get with Mandy if you would be interested in that for anyone on the committee. Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone left to make a motion to adjourn?